Welcome to The Visible Artist. My name is Sophie Loxton Lucas, and I'm delighted to bring you this conversation with painter Marianne Hendriks. Marianne is incredibly professional in the way that she presents her work, and we really talk in depth about why this is important, how she does it, and how it's led to amazing opportunities. So I really hope you enjoy this conversation. Welcome to this episode. I'm delighted to introduce the wonderfully talented painter Marianne Hendriks. Marianne is well known for her botanical oil paintings. Each work is an exploration of the formation of leaves of a single plant. And by focusing on the geometry of these organic forms, Marianne creates striking, almost abstract works, and each one is painted precisely and delicately. These works are wonderful as standalone pieces, but also work well as a collection of 3 or 4, and they've garnered a lot of attention, featured in Vogue Living and the New York Times, and selected recently to be in the collection at Soho Farmhouse. Born and raised in Amsterdam, Marianne began her professional artistic career by studying architecture and spatial design at Central St Martin's in London. Although she then moved into fine art painting, this foundation in architecture has continued to influence how she views and captures the natural world. Her work is also highly informed by the practices of the old Dutch 17th century masters. I've always been struck by how professional Marianne is when presenting her work, both at live exhibitions and online, so I'm really excited to be sitting here and finding out more now.
Hi Marianne, thank you for having me.
Thank you.
So what are you up to at the moment? What are you working on?
I tend to work on many different projects at the same time. I'm doing charity postcards at the moment. And at the moment I'm working with a client. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to even say, but on a big commission in Qatar on a larger piece. So that takes a lot of preparation and the logistics for that. And in preparation for the Soho House, also not sure if I'm allowed to say.
Definitely don't say anything that's a secret.
Well, I always have this kind of like golden rule. Once it's done, I tell everyone. And before, I never want to jinx things. So I tend to work on, several different projects at the same time and then kind of work out the timings of that. I've been also developing new work of the Domesticus collection. Again, also oil paintings and also work on paper. That's something I've always done in the background. Before I decided to move into art, I did a lot of drawing and watercolor works. So now I'm creating work for that as well.
When I think of your work, of course, I think of the botanical pieces. I've seen those many times at the other art fair. And as I mentioned, they've been picked up by publications and Kate Bryan at Soho House. But you've recently launched this new series, which is quite a departure from your previous work.
Well, I don't see it as a departure. I feel like they're kind of like can coexist alongside of each other. That's at least the intention. And the Botanicus collection is still ongoing and I keep developing it as well. I keep finding new ways of portraying plants. I think that would always stay at the core. I think it's such a basic is not the right word, but it's such a at the center of everything.
Yeah.
So that's why I chose to paint leaves.
So how much of your work is working on commissions and how much are you creating works to sell directly through a fair or through galleries?
Most of my work I sell directly or work what I've made myself. I do a lot of commissions. They tend to be quite time consuming. So I tend to choose projects that I think actually really suit me as well. So it's kind of matchmaking feeling and kind of figuring that out. It's always kind of a search as well. Commissions are a lot more complicated. I'm always quite cautious. I always make sure that there's a mediator in between. So I always choose to have a curator, to have a team behind it as well. There's always a lot of logistics. Quite a lot is overseas. So I don't get to always see the space that it's going to be in. That makes it often quite complicated.
And how do you find these curators that work as sort of the in-between person? Do you have a network of people that you've worked with a lot before?
So I work a lot with Saatchi, so they have a really good team. A lot of people seem to find me as well through that. I have been slowly building that up as well. I started out in the art world having no connections and no experience. So I started out cold turkey in a way. I really had this moment where I kind of said to myself, okay, I'm going to be an artist. Now I'm going to go for it. And I didn't know how, however. So I was developing the Botanicus collection to coherent pieces. I started out with 15 pieces. And I started to ask around other artists that I admired and thought produced really amazing work, had a really good way of presenting their work. And first artist I talked to was Daniel Mullen. I don't know if you know him, but he was in the same studio complex as where I was staying at the time in Amsterdam. And I asked him if he could give me some tips. And he very quickly mentioned the other art fair and Saatchi art and told me, kind of how to set myself up. So I had kind of a starting point because you feel quite lost in the beginning of what you're supposed to focus on apart from painting. I think that's always the straightforward part.
Yes.
In a way, there's a lot of other things I do outside of producing work. I could actually write a whole list of things. Often I feel almost like I don't get around painting enough with everything I organize around it to promote it. I see that's a big part of my work as well.
These days particularly, I think before maybe 10 years ago, say, galleries it was a more traditional system where you might work with a gallery and they would handle the promotion of your work. But there's so much that artists have to do so much these days themselves, which is great because they can control that side of it. But it also is a lot of work to be actually creating the work and then being in charge of promoting it and looking after your clients.
It kind of gives you a lot of freedom. So that's the positive part. You have a lot of control over how you show your work. But at the same time, it can also be a great disadvantage to artists. You really need to know so many things. You need to know how to run logistics. You need to know how to run a production. You need to know how to communicate with clients. You need to know how to run your own website and all the promotion material, doing photo shoots. I've always seen myself as a company rather than being a fine artist. So I very much look at my work and think of it as a business. I've come from a very commercial background as well. It always sounds a bit like a dirty word.
Yes.
If I say that word, some artists are like, oh, I want to cringe. You've got to make a living or like don't have to. I mean, ideally, the dream is, of course, to make a living out of it. And that was from day one when I started. That was my ambition, to make a living out of it. I mean, I'm now in year 4 as an artist and I reinvest in my own company as well. So there's a whole, and I have a lot of different income sources. So I don't have just one client. I tend to, I don't count them anymore, but I think I started with 2 or 3 and now I've got about 75.
Wow. So you have a database of 75 clients?
Yeah, that represent me and promote me as well. So
wow.
It's worldwide. Yeah. So, and I keep more people or more companies keep finding me as well. Yeah, domino effect.
Yeah, of course.
In the beginning, this is, of course, very hard to achieve. I do make some compromises of what companies I've worked with, that ideally you would have more control as an artist. And so I have given artwork without knowing where it's going to go or where. So to feel, because I've heard as well a lot of artists say like, I would find it really difficult to know where it's going to end up.
Yes, yeah.
And you kind of have to make peace with that it's going to have its own life. Yeah, so I do keep a very strict database. I do have a ledger where I record everything of where the start-off point is of the artwork. So also to what continent, to what client, and that's kind of my own secret ledger, of course.
Yes, it was. But it's really good that you do that because you're tracking all of your works, and it means that people who buy your work can buy with confidence that you know where your work is and where it's being shown, and it's got that kind of pedigree.
The inspiration not the inspiration, I don't know if you probably know this program. It's called Fake or Fortune.
Oh, yes.
And I watched it at the time and I was just, what a dilemma. And it does discredit the artist a lot if it does get faked. Thankfully, no one has faked my work. Some people do get inspired by my work and then tell me and show me, which is really nice because it's also a way of... the way I create my work, I always feel it's like a way of thinking.
Yes.
And a certain approach to seeing things. And it's nice when other artists have a connection with that and then they take it in a whole different direction again as well. So, Yeah, that's really nice.
Do you ever have to say no to projects? You sounds like you've got so much going on. Sometimes I think artists find it hard to say no.
Yeah, I've recently been started to really think more through what I'm accepting and what I'm declining. Mm-hmm. So I am very careful in negotiation. There's always a complete breakdown of each project, of different elements of what the artist is responsible for and what the client is responsible for. And that's always quite a conversation that takes place also with the curator together. That makes it, of course, a lot easier and quicker. I always recommend to any, if you do commissions, to always have a curator. I know it's quite a cut that gets taken, but it makes such a huge difference. It's so incredibly time consuming to do that. Yeah, I'm a little bit more selective at the moment. I'm also environmentally trying to be conscious. I do find it really difficult to say no. Oh God, I find it so difficult. Because when I started out, my golden rule was to say yes to everything.
Of course.
I mean, I say yes to everything, but cautiously. Especially when I started out, there was a lot of dodgy people contacting me. Yes. I don't know if other artists have experienced this. And now I hardly ever have. But in the beginning, you got these like... I think now I almost kind of like filter them out automatically. But in the beginning, you didn't know who was to or who's to trust. Yeah. You get to know the art world and who are the honest players. Yes. And you have to really get used to all the contracts. In the beginning, I just very carefully was reading through them and trying to understand them. Yeah, as an artist, you do a lot of things on your own and being cautious. Yeah, so I say yes to everything, but like incredibly cautious of. I think my very first painting was someone that was trying, it was so elaborate, trying to buy a painting, but then trying to whitewash it. It was such a bizarre, it was at a fair in Amsterdam. I had no experience. I still had to kind of like learn of how to do everything. This person was trying to buy my artwork via PayPal and had this whole like set. It became more and more complicated. And I was just like, yeah, so yeah, I'm really careful of how, I always have official transaction.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
And even when time to time someone buys a piece directly off me, that's all done officially. A payment is also proof of purchase to a client, which I find important. There's no in-between pieces. So I have a coding system in the back of my paintings. It has a numbering system, which you can't crack.
So you created your own code that can't be cracked by anyone else?
I've got a numbering machine from the Victorian times that I stamp into the back of my paintings. It is an ongoing serial number, which is also recorded in my ledger. I create nothing without that code. So there can't be anyone claiming that they've got a piece of Marianne Hendriks in the future.
Well, I can already see it now on Fake Fortune in about 50 years' time. They'll be listening to this podcast using this information and saying, is the code there? Let's try and crack it. But it's fantastic you have that, because your works are not, they're not inexpensive. They're proper pieces of work. And if people are investing in you as an artist, they're paying a lot of money to get those works. And you want to look after them, and they want to feel really confident that this is a professional work of art that can't be copied or won't pop up somewhere else on a website somewhere. Yeah,
and sometimes artists sell their or give artwork without recording it.
Yeah.
And I think you discredit your own work by that. So I do want to have a very stable market value for my artwork, and keeping to that market value is incredibly important. I want for it to be stable. Selling work off the side would destabilize that.
And did you set your market value when you started based on the work and the materials you were using, or has it increased over the last 4 years?
So there's a complete system behind it.
It doesn't surprise me.
Everything has a system. It's quite, everything is very ordered and very systematic. I always think I do that because I'm otherwise quite chaotic, I think. This is a question that is very difficult to answer because it has different influences of what your market value is. And so I started out a 30 by 40 centimeter art piece of the Botanicus collection. Started off with, I think it was like €300.
Okay.
It's a very different price to what it
I
is
wish
today.
I bought one then.
So now it's €1,100, so £900. That was the price when I did my first fair. So this was determined by size, by the fact I hadn't done any exhibitions yet. So I was in my first few months when I was starting out. Also by the material as well. So in that stage, I guess it was quite underpriced, but I didn't have many costs to cover. My costs have gradually gone up as well. I've got my own photography studio, I've got my own atelier, my own studio, a lot of my own equipment. And then influences of how it grows, the price grows of the paintings is very gradual. But the first step wasn't. So the second fair that I did, I doubled it in price. I was like, okay, let's do this, which I thought was adequate for the materials I'm using as well. It's quite costly as well. I do quite high-end, quite high quality material. I think that's a very important part of the work, is that it's high quality. I gradually increase my pricing. So I have an increase of 15% per year. Every January. So, sorry guys, in January, 15% up. So that's also to calculate inflation, but also I grow as well as an artist. My value also increases as well gradually.
So tell me about working with the Saatchi art curators. How does that work and how do they help you? I mean, I've seen, of course, the other side of it, working with them, and I know how much work they put in, but I'd be interested to hear it from your artist perspective.
I compared simply with doing it without the team. I have to confess I tried a few times without because I was like, God, I really need the money. And the conversation between the client, so little side fact here is 90% of buyers or collectors are inexperienced collectors. So they do have a budget, but have no experience in the whole process because you're simply not familiar with it. If I do it directly with the collector, then I'm educating them at the same time.
Yes.
And they have to take my word for it, which is incredibly complicated. With one client, I was like weeks back and forth. We both really wanted to have this project happening, but I was actually losing money on it because it was just it took so much time to take this collector all through this whole process. And this fact of 90% being inexperienced buyers is by a book of, from Hans Ulbrich. He's written a lot of, statistics you always have to take with a pinch of salt. I haven't back-checked his research. That really gave a good idea reading his books. So I do a lot of research on that as well. Yeah, with that idea that collectors do not have the experience, it makes it incredibly complicated. You want to be painting as an artist.
Of course.
So first of all, and the experience of the curators are just incredible. And there's just so much drive behind it of making projects happen really quickly, asking the right questions, making the collector understand that there needs to be a timeline. It just makes it a bit more official as well, which makes it a lot easier. You're creating a business deal and creating a solid contract, the logistics of the paperwork behind it, the shipping. It's always incredibly complex. So it's really good to have a contract person, to put it really simply. And the curators have so much experience understanding the space, what the client needs are. They usually understand the artist really well. They understand the whole body of work. You have someone guiding you through a process that they understand really well.
And I suppose they're less, I assume they're less emotionally invested. It's a very personal thing to be buying directly from you as the artist. And if there are difficult conversations around money or the transaction, it's
a lot harder.
It's a bit clouded by all of that.
that makes it a lot more complicated indeed. It just becomes a lot easier to talk about money, and it's an important part of the whole process, because you just don't want to be losing money on projects, because you've got your bills to pay, your rent to pay, of course.
And talking of speaking directly to buyers, how do you find standing in front of your work at the other art fair and meeting people and that side of things? Do you enjoy it, or is it, some artists I think find it very intimidating, or they're just very tiring and they prefer to be alone in their studio?
Well, working as an artist is incredibly isolating. So most artists that stand on the fair are like, finally, like, yes, we get to chat, because most of us are quite chatty. Before, I dread it quite often. I get quite nervous. It's, of course, very intimate, very personal. You invest not only a lot of money, it's very emotional. You take a lot of risks as well. I always learn something on the fair. I always learn something from the other artists as well, and from listening to the clients. I always think that you've got two types of art, or there's a few. Well, I mean, there's, in terms of like communication, you sometimes have artists that are just really good at just giving a monologue. Yeah, and they can just like, they might as well be talking to a wall. I've met quite a few artists who just kind of like make these incredible speeches, and they kind of are really good at repeating that same story. I would absolutely go insane if I had to do that. You tend to kind of gauge if someone is interested, or if someone is moved by the work or has a connection with the work. So I tend to chat. I have many conversations, informal, small talk. Connection with the artwork and the artist are the most important. But the idea of selling it, I find that incredibly hard. I don't try to flock off. I don't think I could do that. And I don't think people are comfortable. Like, as a collector, you know if you're interested in a piece of artwork, and if you actually really want to have it. I might have missed out on a few sales, I guess. Often people, they decide for themselves if they want to purchase the work. Often collectors walk over the fair and have a budget in mind. Yeah, which I think is just a lovely idea. Having that in the back of your mind as an artist standing there, but it doesn't feel competitive to me. I think there's always, with the other artists standing next to each other, it doesn't feel like I'm going to steal your, and it doesn't work like that. I never felt that.
Yeah, I always thought that. I was surprised, because you are right next door to all these artists, and there's obviously people walking around, and if their attention, they're looking at your work and then their attention is just diverted, suddenly you've lost them. But it doesn't feel as though the artists are competitive at all. The work is so different that you're all in the same boat, really. But if you have a visitor at your booth looking at the work and they're obviously really interested, do you ever try and translate that into a sale, or do you just really let them lead that part of the conversation? Do you ever do a sales pitch?
I wish I had the courage to really push it into a sales pitch. I obviously know that some artists are really good at that, at like really being quite forward. So sometimes I do. I kind of ask, like, what their motivation is. Are they just looking? Are they looking for something particular in their home? So yeah, I've talked to a few curators to ask, like, oh, what should I say to kind of make a sale happen? But I still find it very difficult.
Do people ever ask for discounts or reduction in price, and would you accept that? That seems like a tricky question for artists.
Yeah, if you made your mind up beforehand. Since the last few fairs, I do like a 10% reduction price, and for multiple purchases is 20%. So I do calculate that within my prices again as well. So logistically, makes sense as well. I think a lot of curators ask for it as well if there's a reduction price, and then I straight away I already have calculated it. I actually tend to do, because I get a bit nervous about doing maths, so I do write it all down.
Yes,
and have a little and I've even put it down on the labels next to the painting, so people can straight away see, like, oh, this is the rate I'm getting it for when I'm purchasing it this week.
That's really wise. I know there was one artist, this was a while ago now, but she sold a really large painting at the fair, and she was, of course, really thrilled to sell it. But I think that the buyer had been quite aggressive in his bargaining skills and really pushed her too low. And because she hadn't done the calculation before, she ended up selling the piece for a much lower price than she was happy to. So it was actually quite a negative experience for her, which is a shame. But on the other hand, she sold this really large piece. But it just put her in a very difficult position. So it's very wise to prepare your discounts in advance.
Yeah, absolutely. And calculated beforehand. I have like my 15 and 20%, and that's what I'm happy with. If someone is really like very pushy, I might, but I don't, I have a market value. Mm-hmm. I don't want to divert too much from that. So absolutely, you don't want it to be a negative experience. I think I once bought an art piece together with my dad whilst I was exhibiting myself on the other art fair. And I hope I didn't overwhelm this artist, but I had a little bit of experience. So I was like, I want to negotiate. And she was like, and I think it was also it was such a beautiful piece. My dad and we both fell in love with it. A piece that she was very attached to. I think she hadn't exhibited and she hadn't put it up for sale before this fair. So also then to ask for a price reduction was like quite a lot for her to take in. But I was just like, no, but we really love it so much, but you have to give us a reduction. As long as it's a pleasant experience for both sides, I think that's really important.
Your work has been picked up by various publications, including Vogue. How did that come about?
According to my mother, it's a miracle. Just like, oh, you're so lucky, Dan. But it was actually a rather calculated move. I prepared for it for 6 months. A lot of people are quite surprised about that. From day one, I digitalized my artwork. So all my artwork is in immaculate portrait online. In continuity as well, because the green I use is very particular as well. So I scanned all my work professionally by 3D scanner, not at home, but by a professional company, and created a database for this. Because publication is, I don't know much about publication, but it's very much about spacing. Very often there's a subject they're writing about, and it just needs to fit in, and you need to deliver the artwork, digital artwork, in time. So I have a G Drive system where I've got all my work online, and there's a whole database for each painting. It's an incredible amount of work to even keep up with it. I'm producing a lot more work. It becomes a lot more work to set it all up. So I've got this incredible database. I've got a link that I sent over to publicists when they're just before printing time. So Vogue Living, for example, I contacted several magazines that I knew were writing about botanical subjects. I think they sent me a message and said, like, we need that image within 3 minutes. And I think I was driving in a car and they were like, we need it now. And I just sent them over the link. So not even WeTransfer. So this is a little bit more convenient because you have to sometimes calculate as well if you yourself don't have internet. And the files are quite big again. So you want it to be very accessible. The New York Times as well, I got everything ready and I was very flexible and said, like, well, you can choose whichever image you want to pick and just send them the link. Often what these magazines or all the magazines do, they have a deadline. They need to publish something. They probably will ask 4 or 5 different artists that they like. And whomever is most prepared, they will pick. So there is a bit of you can't calculate. I mean, you can't. There's also a little bit of luck involved, but I don't really let it come down to luck. I really prepare for it. So when the New York Times contacted me, I was like already prepared months ago to make sure I had the material for them so they could make a publication.
Yeah, that's amazing. You're ready for the call from the New York Times.
The high quality images you have to create yourself. So you have a lot of really great companies that photograph or scan the artwork. And I recommend this highly because once you sell your artwork, it's lost forever.
Of course, yeah.
Or not lost forever. I mean, often it's somewhere in Qatar or America or Asia. You can't just say like, oh, could you just ship it back, because it's incredibly expensive. And once it's purchased, it is no longer yours to do anything with. So straight away recording your work digitally is incredibly important. And now you also do this for license agreements and reproduction possibilities. So that's also part of my income as well.
Really? How does that work if someone's bought a piece? Do you incorporate that into the agreement when they buy the piece, or is it separate from pieces that you're selling?
They get the painting, but they don't have the imaging right. So the license right always remains to the artist automatically, even if it doesn't say it in the contract. Yeah, I also did a lot of research on, finding it all out, how it all works. You remain the owner of the license of your own work. And that, of course, you can have exclusive contracts. Most of the time it's non-exclusive. But if you do print, or you specialize in print and in photography, that works slightly differently, because then you do everything limited to a certain number, and then the pricing is then adjusted to that again.
And do you create prints from your originals?
Till now, I have let lots of clients do that. I just did not get around doing it. So Saatchi's been running limited editions. I actually had a conversation with Rebecca Wilson in New York in 2018, I think it was in the spring. And I asked her advice on this, because I really want to remain in the high-end, high-quality market. That's very much at the core of my work as well, is the quality. And she said, absolutely be careful with doing cheap reproductions. So she said, you really want to stay in the fine art segment, and the exclusivity of it is an important part of it. So purposely kind of waited a few years. I could have already generated income in year 1, 2, and 3, but I waited till year 4 now. So I've only very recently started to do high-end prints. So I worked together with a print house in Amsterdam together to create limited editions. So I only started that like 2 months ago. So
that's exciting. But that sounds like very wise advice from Rebecca, of course. Especially the nature of your work, I can imagine that prints would be incredibly successful and popular. But to preserve your work like that is really wise, and it's sort of playing the long game, isn't it?
Yeah, because you want to do this for longer, than you don't want to burn out too quickly. You kind of want to make sure you can last a whole career out of it. I mean, it's incredible to stand on the other art fair and ask for advice, because there's so many question marks hovering above a lot of things. I know all these things because I've talked to many people. I read a lot of research papers on this. I read a lot of books. I keep learning about it as well. And I came in the industry knowing absolutely nothing, and I've been growing and learning as I've been going along. And you kind of adjust your strategies around how the market functions. And then again, of course, I ask a lot of curators that are walking around at the other art fair, which is absolutely incredible to have their expertise and insight. But also amongst artists, like,
of course,
we exchange a lot of ideas, but also like helping each other out. For this particular fair, which was the last one I've done, was a great challenge to do because of COVID and Brexit. And no one knew the rules. So you would call up the embassy and just like, so what do I need to do? And they were like, well, we don't know. And so I've collaborated with a photographer called Paul Browns.
Oh yes, I know as well. Yes.
And we ended up nervously calling each other every day and finding out and exchanging information. Like, he got things delivered to my house. He managed to take a few furniture pieces for me over to London from Amsterdam, and get the whole like logistics around it, because doing a fair, there's a lot of preparation for it.
Absolutely. I think tapping into the artist network, whether you're doing a fair or a gallery opening or anything really, it's always worth talking to your fellow artists. Well, everything that you've done, Marianne, is just so professional to such a high standard. Probably, I mean, I don't want to assume, but I imagine even better than lots of galleries might do. So it's all very well deserved, your success. And
oh, thank you.
I think we don't really have much more time to talk.
I could never go on.
This conversation has been so jam-packed with advice, amazing advice. So thank you for being so generous with that and sharing your tips.
Pleasure. Cheers.
And it was lovely to talk to you. Thank you.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening this week. Please do follow Marianne at Marianne Hendriks and the podcast at The Visible Artist Podcast. And thank you so much for everyone who has downloaded, listened, rated and reviewed. It really helps boost the podcast in the charts. Next week, I'll be bringing you another inspiring artist. So in the meantime, I hope you enjoy your time in the studio and I'll see you next Friday.